Toby Miller, thank you for coming. For me, it's a great honor and a pleasure to introduce you. Thanks for coming to Lisbon in your first time, in Portugal, first time in Lisbon. Toby has written over 30 books, translated into several languages, and he's written on about subjects like television studies, cultural policies, popular culture, sport and gender, and Hollywood. I'm going to make some highlights about his work to do with the things that I've read, reading, and I've found useful. For instance, he wrote Global Hollywood. The second edition came out in 2004, which is, broadly speaking, about political economy of Hollywood, with an emphasis on work, labor, the material aspects beyond textual analysis, the issue of intellectual property, government policies, and he introduces a very useful concept and theorizes it, the concept of new international division of cultural labor. Also important, I found in my work, and for instance, is Toby's trenchant critique of the current love affair, so to speak, between government, universities, and so-called cultural industries. He's written this article, which came out in Cultural Studies, the journal, from creative to cultural industries. Not all industries are cultural and no industries are creative. As you can see, it's a very interesting title. Also another thing I'd like to point out is that Toby has published with other scholars, so he's keen on collective work, which I find also very interesting, with George Udis, Robert Stam, Richard Maxwell, and many others. And also that coming from the Anglo-American Center, Toby is not oblivious of the so-called periphery, and is collaborating with scholars from Latin America, like Nestor Garcia Canclini, and he has a real interest in local and national specificities, which I also found very interesting in his work. I think that he gives us tools to think through. For instance, for me, in my case, the Portuguese economic crisis, even though some of my colleagues from Korea have questioned this term crisis, because of course for many people the crisis is a permanent condition. So when we talk about crisis, for many people it's always there, it's always been there. And perhaps the crisis, as you know, the social and economic crisis in Portugal, which, well, started with the Troika in 2011 and has it's officially over when Troika left, but many people would dispute that. So I think that you have all these tools, theoretical tools, that might help you to understand some of these aspects, the cultural shift and many other things. So it is, to sum up, for these reasons and many others, that I think it's worth listening to Toby. And so, the topic today is going to talk about green in the media. So Toby, thank you again.
Thank you, Sophia. So I'm going to step down here, if that's okay. I want to thank Sophia and all the members of the organizing committee for inviting me. I can't speak Portuguese, so I'm sorry, I'm speaking in English. If you have any questions in Castellano, I can answer. And I have something to wake you up, because it's very difficult to be awake after lunch, especially when someone is speaking in another language. So whoever catches this football gets a free copy of my book. Now, the reason why I'm throwing the football and not the book is this. Sophia mentioned that my friend and co-author George Udice, who can speak Portuguese, was hit in the eye when I threw one of these books in Hong Kong during a conference and nearly lost the sight of that eye. And so, having learnt that lesson of not removing the eyesight of your co-author, when I was in Guadalajara the next week, I announced what I was going to do, and I threw the book up like this very gently, and it split the lip of a social psychologist, because the man in front of her tried to catch the book and didn't, and knocked it up and it hit her under the lip. So, the people from Guadalajara gave me this football, American football, football americano, which is soft. And they said, next time you throw this, okay? Whoever picks it up first gets the book. Oh, very gentle. Oh, yes, sorry. Hair colour. Different hair colour. Okay, so your past is always with you. You never really leave it behind. And I want to talk indeed about this topic, greening the media, which is the subject of a book I wrote with Richard Maxwell. There it is, little product placement for you. This is from a feminist bookstore in Maine, in New England, in the United States. That's a feminist thumb you can see on the book. And we also write a blog every month, like a column, in Psychology Today, which is a popular magazine in the United States. It's on newsstands, magazine stands, but actually our column is only online. So we try to keep up, and in addition to this scholarly book with Oxford, and that we write op-eds, so the New York Times, The Guardian, Clarín, Huffington Post, these sorts of places, to try to get the message out. And what is the message? The message really is very simple, and it is that we live in an anthropocentric era that needs to become more ecocentric. I wonder how many of you are familiar with the term anthropocentric? Yeah? So one or two. So maybe I explain what I mean and try to make particular reference to film studies. So the idea of anthropocentrism, which comes from both feminist eco-philosophy and eco-philosophy more generally, is that it centers humanity at the core of thinking, of what matters. And if you want to relate this to classical European philosophy, particularly the philosophizing of the coming of modernity, then Hegel would be a good place to start, because Hegel basically says that the natural world has no standing, has no significance, no status, and what matters is the conquest of that world by humanity. And it is through the overcoming and the transformation of things that real ownership is gained. And you can see how this then leads into a Marxist idea about the importance of material transformation to change epochs and to grant legitimacy. Now, the problem with the Hegelian idea is that he includes in this semiosis, so the making of meaning, right? Unless you transform nature and make meaning from it, you are not fully human. And you can see also how this is one of the ways in which that logic pervades the taking away of indigenous rights, with the doctrine of terra nullius, of empty space. The idea that indigenous peoples, particularly those who led so-called nomadic existences, did not make permanent changes to the places where they lived, did not leave semiotic marks, were not creative in an ongoing sense, and therefore had no rights to land. And the same logic applies to the other creatures who live on the earth with us, right? So I'm picking on Hegel, but you could go and look at many other important Western European philosophers. One of the reasons why the animal world is ours to control is because the animal world, according to his logic, does not make semiotic marks. Unlike the plant world, it may radically transform through purposive, deliberate mental activity, things around it. You know, animals build nests, right? Animals create dams, they do these things, but there is no ongoing semiotic value, and there is no desire, according to Hegel and the dominant philosophers of his ilk, to leave traces, to leave marks, to build culture, right? Now, there are countervailing tendencies you can find in David Hume, in John Stuart Mill and others, where Hume talks about how animals clearly transform culture deliberately, clearly make meaning, and clearly pass on knowledge to other generations. How do cats learn to be cats? They learn from other cats, right? But by and large, that is the dominant meme, the dominant logic, this anthropocentrism, and that the world, in a sense, is given to us to transform. And by transforming it, we make it all the more ours. And that this is, according to Hegel, how nations are built and so on. Well, how does this apply then to an area like the study of the moving image? It applies in the sense that the vast majority, we would argue, of the materials produced in the languages that we speak, in the groups that I work with, in the study of communications or media or cinema or film or visual culture, whatever term you care to use, the predominant logic is about consciousness. Even if it is political economy, that it's looking at ownership and control, or the new International Division of Cultural Labour that Sophia mentioned, even if it is about, for instance, shot length and the importance of shot length for determining, supposedly, the success of films in the commercial marketplace, even if it is about ideas of a counter-public sphere, the logic all the time, be it formalist, be it political economic, be it policy-oriented, is what is going on inside the heads of viewers. This is why this stuff matters, right? And that dominant underpinning anthropocentric logic, innocent enough and understandable enough and legitimate enough in many ways as it is, undermines the possibility of a genuinely alternative ecocentric perspective. So, for instance, when we talk about the environment and film, or the environment and television, for most people that tends to signify how well or ill the media cover things like climate change, right? So you talk about a film that is about environmental destruction, and you describe it in terms of its formal textual qualities, but also in terms of how adequately or inadequately it represents the status of scientific knowledge, yes, and how well or ill it represents the state of public debate about that knowledge. That tends to be the way in which books about eco-media, eco-cinema, whatever, operate. Does this text adequately convey what is known to be the case about environmental change or environmental despoliation, and does it also enlist or engage or describe controversy surrounding that topic? Again, a perfectly legitimate thing to do, but completely anthropocentric. What about the very simple and yet very complicated question of the carbon footprint of the commodity sign itself? In other words, what is the ecological impact of the film, whether the film is about the environment or not? And what we want is to see a new tradition in the historiography of media technologies, as well as contemporary debates about them, that takes into account their entire life as commodity signs. I hope that will become clearer as I go along. Please feel free, if things are not clear, to ask, and I can try to help out, to explain, or somebody can translate my slightly weird syntax into better syntax. Yes? Okay. So, part of the issue with this anthropocentrism is this kind of evolutionary logic about humanity. It's an appealing model. I think you get the point. Actually, I think that's Sergio in the middle with the spear, isn't it? He says no, but I think it might be. Right down to the president, Tiago, at the computer monitor. And this is the idea that we have gone through a series of magical, radical transformations, right, that are about the creation of the hominid, on through subsistence, then agriculture, then the Industrial Revolution, until finally we are constantly hunched over the keyboard, making meaning, being good semiotic creatures as Hegel commanded. And indeed, there we are. It's even reached the point where a kind of socialist realism, like a classic Maoist iconography, right, of workers uniting together to transform their world. We hold up laptops, except, of course, in about 3 seconds' time, nobody will know what a laptop is, since they're dying already. But for the moment, that's a magical notion of this transformation, and the supposed transcendence that comes from making meaning. This relates very interestingly to the Guardian newspaper. Do people know the Guardian newspaper, right? Which is the left liberal daily Bible, in a sense, in the English-speaking world. Originally based in Manchester, now based in London, New York, and Sydney. It has 3 editions every day, and it's blossoming as this left liberal daily incantation of prayer. Every year, it lists the most important people in the bourgeois media. Normally, our great uncle, the Grand Vizier Rupert Murdoch, is number 1. Last year, he was number 8. The most important person in the bourgeois media, according to The Guardian last year, you. Why? Because you have laptops and cell phones, and you now control, according to this logic, all content. So the conventions of political economy, of public policy, about scarcity, about ownership and controls concentration, and the problems that derive therefrom no longer apply because you have transcended the status of consumers or readers or audience members. Now you can make meaning yourselves. This is going back to 1980 when Alvin Toffler, the Reaganite futurist, coined the term prosumer. Right? He was talking about French pregnancy testing kits, but now the term is used to describe all of you, which is to say, me as well, all of us, that you are the person of the year. And there you are, leaping magically from an old-fashioned, fat-screen, analog television set to a bright, brand new, spanking, thin, beautiful digital television set. How many here have thrown away or gotten rid of analog TV sets in the last 5 years? How many people? Right? So about half. Do you know where your analog TV set went? Sergio, you threw it in the front garden, right? Where did your analog TV go?
They usually replace it when you buy the new one in a store.
They take it.
Yeah.
Portugal is so advanced. This is fantastic. This is the only country in the world that I've gone to as part of my frequent polluter miles accrual of flying privileges where people actually know that their television set is taken away in that manner. Does anybody know where it went next? Well, it probably went to Brazil. We'll talk about that later. The other interesting thing about that television set is that the new one uses more electricity and in a hot climate creates more heat and therefore encourages people to use more cooling devices while they're watching it. But don't worry, because all that matters is textuality. And here is the magic of the social media as they have transformed you from being audiences to active critical producers. My favorite is LinkedIn. And the one at the bottom, if you can't read it, is Google+. I'm a Google employee who eats donuts. This is the new magical world of the digital media, transforming us from passive recipients of messages to active creators of them. Here's someone who is a little more skeptical. I'm sure many of you recognize this person. George Orwell, who was, in addition to being a colonial police officer in what is now Malaysia, and a homeless person in what is still Paris and London, and a film critic for the Communist Party of Great Britain, and a radio producer for the author of a couple of not very important books called 1984 and Animal Farm. And here he is in his guise as a radio producer. And I'm going to put up on the screen next, I hope, something he wrote 70 years ago in 1944 about the period 100 years ago, 1914, and the idea that various new forms of transportation and communication technology were utterly changing the landscape not only of meaning, but of world politics, and for the better. So there are two key terms here that we might find ourselves saying, or we might hear, or we might read on at least a weekly basis: the abolition of distance and the disappearance of frontiers. He read these words a century ago. He thought they were silly then. They kept recurring for the next 30 years. He still thought they were silly. And they're problematic, of course, today. The aeroplane did not bring world peace so much as it brought high-altitude bombing. The radio did not only bring interdependence, it brought Goebbels and the big lie. Let's jet forward, though, 50 years from when Orwell spoke, to the idea of a Magna Carta. This is not the Magna Carta that supposedly pioneered democracy in the early 13th century. This is the Magna Carta for the Information Age, written by Alvin Toffler, whom I mentioned earlier, by George Gilder, by various other prophets of futurism who were key figures in the creation of the Cold War discourse of the development of US information and communication technologies from the 60s through to the 80s, and then generated this famous document, which I think embodies in words what I hope you saw in those images of the idea of the evolution of man, in inverted commas, from simian to keyboard user. But we need a different kind of understanding of the world we occupy. It's a more materialist one, and it is one that says that the idea of the information age as a triumph of the mind is spurious, specious claptrap. In fact, it's one that is utterly dependent on the place where George Orwell was an imperial police officer, what we now call Malaysia, and the materials that were harvested there by the British especially, and that continue to be the core of the internet. The internet comes from British imperialism in Malaysia because it's the basis of the materials that are the submarine cables all around the world. Now, you can't see terribly well, probably, at least at the back, but this is made up to look like a very old map. It was actually created a month ago. But the idea is to show how venerable and important these lines are. So, can you see some of the thin lines across oceans that connect the continents? Those are the submarine cables that basically connect the world through the internet. It's mostly not satellites, it's actually very material, ocean-based submarine cables. And therefore, in addition to the cutting down of the trees that in Malaysia that formed the basis of those cables, it is also something that is intervening in the world of our oceans. In addition to the idea of the internet, or as part of the idea of the internet being this weightless domain, we are often invited to participate in a thing called the cloud. Does anybody know what the cloud is? Can anyone tell me? Is this a term that's used in Portuguese?
Yes.
Right? Does anybody know actually what it is? It's not a trick question. I just want to know. I mean, I've been trying to find out for 5 years. Right? Because when I think of a cloud, I think of an entirely benign, or basically benign, natural entity that floats above me, rains down on the ground, allows agriculture to happen, allows animals to live, including ourselves, and basically goes away. It is an ephemeral and natural state of affairs. But that is the cloud. Right? That is a server farm. There are probably some very big ones here in Lisbon. I don't know where they are, and probably nobody here does. Does anybody know where the big server farms are in Lisbon? Okay. Do you know where the post office is in Lisbon? The major central post office? Yeah. Do you know where the telephone exchange is in Lisbon? The major central telephone exchange. You're all too young. When I was growing up, the two great public entities, the two signs of socialism, basically, were the post office and the telephone exchange. Well, the great new sign of communications today is unseen and unsocialized. It's the cloud. It's not up there, it's not ephemeral, it's very material, very perennial, it's in very, very large, dominant buildings that are not called anything, like a post office or a telephone exchange, and therefore do not appear on the horizon as obvious things in the way that those entities did. They're in privately owned corporation offices, and they take up maybe 6 stories. They're being built every second that we speak in almost in every country in the world, and they are that, and that is the cloud. And they have some of the most advanced and complicated air conditioning systems and other forms of electronics in the world. Finally, some film. Who here did not cry when little Leo turned blue? Laura did not cry when Leo turned blue? Shame on you. You call yourself a film studies feminist and you did not weep when Leo turned blue. Explain yourself, please. You're right, later. Okay. I never put people on the spot. Do not alienate your audience. Lesson 1. Okay. Sergio, you also didn't cry when Leo turned blue.
I didn't.
Can you share with the group right now why you did not cry when little Leo turned blue?
I just wasn't that moved.
You just didn't care. Shame on you. These television studies people, they just don't have it in them. Who did cry? Come on. Who cried? I didn't cry, by the way. Well, plenty of reasons to cry when Leo turned blue, particularly if you were a Poporlano. Does anybody know where the Titanic water scenes were filmed? Right? Yeah, in Popotla, in Baja California, in what is, I think, still the largest water tank in the world. And you can go on a tour of the Fox studios to see the tank. Poporlanos are traditionally a fishing people, as you may be aware. It's almost 20 years since Leo turned blue in their town, and their fishing catch is still down 30% because of the impact of desalination and also the pollution of surrounding waters by the filmmakers. In order to do that, the filmmakers decided that the most important thing was to keep Mexicans out of Mexico. Now, normally in the United States, the thing we want to do is to keep Mexicans out of the United States, except when they are working for us directly. But in fact, in this case, we decided to keep them out of Mexico itself. So Paramount and Fox, or whoever it was, I guess Fox, built a wall around the tank they were building to keep the Popotlanos out. Local artists and US artists in collaboration with them created a series of artworks that they put on the walls on the wall surrounding this area that kept them out in order to draw attention to what was being done. As a consequence of this, one of the big European foundations gave them an award the next year for the most innovative artwork protesting at capitalism. That award, which was of, I think, 30,000 euros, was a third of the award that the same foundation gave to Fox for the most innovative special effects of the year in Titanic. Now, as we know, Leo, once he got over turning blue, became green. Leo is an ecologist. Only last year, you'll recall that he took, and I quote, a year's sabbatical to fly around the world to save the Earth. Right? And part of his becoming an environmentalist was making this film, The Beach. Now, my guess is many fewer people saw this, and probably none of you who did cried. than was the case with Titanic. Did anybody see The Beach? Did you see it in a movie theatre or on television? Anybody actually pay money directly to see this film? You did, one person. Normally two. There are 2, 3. This is great. There are normally more people who didn't cry when he turned blue than paid money to see The Beach. So can you tell us briefly what it's about? What happens to Leo in The Beach? Any of you? I mean, just because you saw the film doesn't mean you remember everything, I know. I saw a film this morning, I can't tell you what it was about. But it's set in Thailand, and it is about a group of first world, global north people who go to an Edenic world, and of course their lives unravel. Yes, is that a reasonable précis?
They create a community.
They create a community. Well, some of you will have heard of Danny Boyle. Yes, who's an English film director. He is the patron saint of the liberal left in Britain and a thoroughgoing racist and environmental criminal. So Boyle arrived in Thailand to shoot the film and decided that the Thai beaches did not look enough like beaches in Thailand. So he had them bulldozed and replanted and recreated so they would look like his vision of a Thai beach. He also decided that people in Thailand were, as he put it, environmentally ignorant, so he taught them about the environment. We don't know what lessons he taught them. We only know that he paid hundreds of thousands of US dollars to the military and the Tourism Commission, which are the entities on a corrupt basis that permit filming on the islands. We also know that he gave an interview in which he described it as being impossible to say the names of Thai people because they were so fucking long, quote unquote. But he is the patron saint of the National Health Service in Britain, so much respect to Danny Boyle. Now, 4 years after The Beach was made, as you're aware, there was an earth-shattering tsunami which hit Thailand amongst many other countries and killed hundreds of thousands of people. There's no suggestion that when Hollywood, courtesy of Danny Boyle, tore apart those particular beaches in order to make them look more like Thai beaches, there's no suggestion that that directly led to deaths. But of course, what did lead directly to deaths was similar actions taken all over Asia by hotels and developers to tear apart mangrove swamps that were natural defense systems against tsunamis, the better to create hotels in places right by the water for the attraction of Western money. So here are 2 instances, Titanic and The Beach, where there are very interesting stories about nature contained within the films themselves, but these stories about nature contained within the films themselves are nothing compared to the immediate and ongoing, in the case certainly of Titanic, environmental impact of their making. In the case of The Beach, the so-called ignorant Thais who didn't have an environmental consciousness compared to Danny Boyle had, of course, many non-government organisations, civil society entities dedicated to environmental protection. They sued the filmmakers, and it took 6 years, but they won $500,000 in the Thai Supreme Court because of the corruption and the despoliation that had been overseen by Hollywood. But if you look up The Beach in a book about Leonardo DiCaprio's films, or you look up The Beach in a journal issue dedicated to tourism and cinema, you will almost certainly find nothing about those topics. Now let's talk about, once now we've had our little Hollywood bit, some of the everyday electronics that we own, we take pleasure from, and are significant parts of often our methods of doing our study. This is an old fat-screen analogic television. It is the most difficult manufactured item in world history to recycle. It has more poisons, more dangerous gases, more carcinogens in it than an automobile, a train, you name it. Here is the chemical table, the table of elements. All the ones that are highlighted in bright red are the elements that are in your cell phone. Cell phone, mobile phone, whatever. And I should say, I don't own a television, sadly, but I do own cell phones, and I own laptops, and I own tablets. I am as responsible as anybody else for the condition that I am describing. Okay, so as far as you're concerned, when you use these phones, the fact of the presence of this vast array of chemicals inside them is not of significance. Somehow or other this is in Spanish, sadly not Portuguese, but here is a slide, and there'll be quite a few more in Spanish, about the toxic effects that can apply to people's bodies who are involved with these telephones. How can they apply? Well, generally, there's a lot of controversy, as I'm sure you're aware, about their impact on users. But there is no controversy about their impact on those who make them, and there is no controversy about the impact on those who recycle them, and there is no controversy about their impact on the environment. How do we know all of this? Most of the science on this does not come from people in the United States, or West Germany, or Canada, or Japan, or any of those wealthy countries. Almost all the science published on the topics that I'm going to be talking about as we continue this afternoon comes from Brazil, India, China, Mexico. Why? Because these are the places where these phones are dumped, where these television sets are dumped. Oh, I left out, I'm sorry, Nigeria and Ghana, the other two major places where the science comes from. This is where they're dumped. This is where they have an appalling impact on the environment, an appalling impact on the bodies of the unprotected workers, many of them under teenage years, who pull them apart in order to extract valuable minerals. So that is where the knowledge comes from, and that is where the problem is experienced, by and large. So, for example, I don't know if you can read this at the back, but in 2010, the US disposed of 2,439,000 tons of waste generated from electronic devices. 649,000 recycled, the remainder thrown into landfills or incinerated. With landfills, this affects the water table, it affects animal life, it affects plant life, it affects suburban life. With incineration, all of those things plus the air. Here is an example of the contents. This is a very gruesome slide of a bird that was a victim of Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina that went through 10 years ago, New Orleans, Mississippi, through the Gulf in the United States. And you can see a cigarette lighter in there, but there are also plugs and even part of a keyboard inside that bird. Here is a map. It's 5 years old, so it's slightly suspect, about known and suspected routes of e-waste or electronic waste in Europe. In the European Union, it's called WEEE in English, dumping. So, you see the kind of lemon colour as per Australia, yes? That circle, sort of a lemon colour. That is a known source. In other words, where are the wealthy countries that are exporting this detritus at high rates because of their massive consumption of media technologies? Australia, Japan, South Korea, the EU, and the United States. Where does it go? There are known destinations. These are the ones in bright red. Mexico, Brazil, Nigeria, Pakistan, India, Thailand, China, Singapore, and suspected destinations in the lighter red: Chile, Argentina, Venezuela, Haiti, Egypt, UAE, Ukraine, Russia, Kenya, Tanzania, Malaysia, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia. Now, of course, the big change in the last 5 years is that now there are huge middle classes in India and China, and so rather than being net importers of the detritus of the pleasures of film studies, televisions, phones, computers, they are actually manufacturing them, consuming them, and then recycling them. So they're taking all the waste that comes from other places, but they're now getting rid of these things at a great rate through built-in obsolescence themselves. And this is a later map, and this is a city-based rather than so much as a country-based map. You'll know all the names there: Accra and Lagos in Western Africa, Delhi, but you won't probably know the name Guiyu, which is in southeastern China. Guiyu, like Popotla, used to be a fishing town. Now it is the boom town for electronic waste recycling from all over the world, most of it undertaken by girls aged 5 to 8 years of age, in a village that now has 95% of children under the age of 8 with lead poisoning. And it is attracting more and more and more families from across China to do illegal, unsafe e-waste recycling. The basic route that things take to get there is they go to Hong Kong, where I just was. I should say I've been to several of these places, as have many other scholars. They go to Hong Kong, they are illegally then reshipped from there to different parts of China, especially Guiyu, which is obviously very close, for this recycling, and then the precious metals contained therein are reutilized for the manufacture in the same country, but in other parts of the country, of these newer technologies for sale. And now I'm going to show you a few pictures, different pictures of e-waste recycling. Some of these pictures are examples of what is sometimes called poverty porn. Okay? So you have a white guy from the global north with a name that is known to you, or at least you were given, showing pictures of very poor people from the global south whose names are not known and are not given. Right? So just as one can talk about the hypocrisy, the double standard, at least the paradox of owning and utilizing these technologies to draw attention to the problems associated with them, so one can also criticize the imagery, the use of imagery that I'm engaging in now. Not so much in this picture. This is an example of one of the very technologically advanced and safe factories that do electronic waste recycling. There are many of them around the world. They're extremely efficient. They're also very costly compared to other sources of labor. I've already mentioned the sources of labor in China. Here are some pictures that Greenpeace took, that they shared with me, of people operating unsafe soldering operations. You can see the young age of that young girl there with the disc in her hands. Here's someone from a Nigerian dump working through the equivalent of a central processing unit, the key element that is where many of the valuable goodies are contained. And here's a stretch of water in China, completely polluted with electronic waste, with the detritus of the pleasures of film and television. Here's a man protecting his eyes because the extraordinary array of diseases that these workers get covers the entire body, as you can imagine from the toxic effects slide that I showed earlier. Everything from appalling diarrhea problems to the loss of eyesight from burning, unbelievable impacts on reproductive capacities, particularly for females. And there is also, don't worry, because I'm in cultural studies, there will be a positive, happy bit to all of this in addition to the poverty porn. There has to be the upside. And this is one of the interesting, more arty pictures of one of the toxic e-waste dumps in West Africa. Because in addition to the scientists, environmental scientists, occupational health and safety experts, medical scientists, and so on, from the countries I mentioned, from West Africa, from Brazil, from India, from China, those places and others have many artists who are both reutilizing electronic waste as raw material for their artworks and also using their art to draw attention to this horror. This is such an example. This is a young man who is literally on a sea polluted with the remnants of computers. And there are some very interesting and inventive forms of activism against electronic waste, trying to get governments to be proactive and reasonable in their dealings with this problem. The example I'm giving you here is from Argentina and a series of actions undertaken by Greenpeace employees and volunteers in Buenos Aires. Anybody here from Argentina? Okay, so I guess you can all interpret that, right? I don't need to tell you what it's saying, it's kind of easy for you. Is that right? Yeah? So this is about trying to get a law passed that is going to make illegal e-waste dumping and is going to make secure forms of recycling things like batteries. Yes? Here they are dressed up as if they were a bomb squad, and they're talking about batteries as bombs that need to be deactivated because of the impact they have on the environment. In the United States, the worst occupational health and safety dangers for any occupation is for those people who work in the making of batteries. In the United States, by the way, in terms of e-waste, the major workers are slaves. Slavery is still legal in the United States, believe it or not. The quid pro quo with the slaveholding states for the 13th Amendment after the Civil War was that federal prisoners who were on felony charges could be forced to work against their will. So if you've ever wondered why so many Latinos and African Americans are locked up, it's in part because they continue to be, particularly in the case of blacks, given their history, a slave population. And men in particular in federal prisons are required to do entirely unsafe electronic waste recycling as part of their imprisonment. So, back to Argentina and this activism. Here they are outside the House of Deputies. Don't worry, those are not real anal cavities. Those are masks modelling anal cavities, in case there's anybody here who comes from a very religious background and is easily offended. This is mimesis, this is not the real. So everything's okay? All right? Moving away from Argentina, because does everybody here hate Argentines like they do? The rest of the world hates them, I don't know why. It does. So moving away from Argentina, here is another representation, a kind of Turnerian representation in the art world of some of the impact of e-waste. Here are some earrings made from circuit boards. And there's more direct agitprop. For example, these mock sheep with telephone heads. It's nice to see an old telephone like that. Anybody here got a telephone like that still? Is anybody here young enough that they have never had a telephone like that? And here again is a representation of what happens to monitors, but you can see it's very heavily textualized, right? It's been treated, it's been regenerated by the artist to draw attention to it. And here, an imagined shower curtain made of these products. Here, an attempt, in a sense, to get us to think about the technological sublime. One of the extraordinary capacities of consumer electronics is to bring together two strands of philosophical thought in Western aesthetics that are normally quite separate, right? One strand is the beautiful, the gorgeous, the adorable, the feminine within that Kantian model. The other, the awesome power of nature and technology, the masculine. And the amazing thing that companies like Apple do is to bring together the awesome computing power of the technology with the beauty and the slimline notion of consumption. Yes? That is, in a sense, being problematized by this artwork, which redisposes these objects in their leftover status as frightening and awesome and violent and dangerous. And then, of course, there are people who try to mock the particular multicultural notion of the ideal consuming subject that is so central to companies like Apple. Coming up with lines like this: warning, contact with this object would cause your death. Not something people think about when they're teaching courses on the history of media technology. And at the border between Mexico and the United States, a leftover television set. Why does this matter? Well, you probably know that Mexico is the world's largest manufacturer of television sets, ahead of China and Vietnam, which are 2 and 3. And of course, the irony is that the televisions that these people make in Tijuana, in the maquilas, cost more to buy there than they do over the border in San Diego once they've been exported to the United States. Consumers pay more in Tijuana than they do in San Diego. That's to do with public policy issues and the end of the Bracero guest worker program in the 60s and the formation of these maquilas. But the other irony is that this is one of the places where in the informal sector, not the formal sector of the economy where television sets are made, but the informal sector where they are illegally and unsafely recycled, members of the same family of the people who make the sets are doing the e-waste recycling. Yes? And putting these television sets by the border is trying to bring those contradictions to life. Here's some very, again, an attractive look, but one that is trying to make people say, where did you get that jewellery from? What's that necklace? What's that bracelet? And then have it explained to you. You're probably all too young to know what an Etch-a-Sketch was, but anybody own one apart from me? I'm probably the only person who owned one, but this was the predecessor to the iPad from the 1960s. And I want to finish with this quotation from a Nazi. Now, normally, I'm not given to quoting Marty the Nazi in a positive way, in fact, at all. But I think he had a lot to say that was very helpful about technology. Is that legible at the back? Can everybody, you can't read it. Okay. Anybody want to do a quick translation into Portuguese? It's not very easy. I translated into Spanish, it took me about an hour to try to get the right words. So maybe I'll just read it out in English, yeah? The forester who measures the felled timber in the woods, and who, to all appearances, walks the forest path in the same way his grandfather did, is today ordered by the industry that produces commercial woods, whether he knows it or not. He is made subordinate to the orderability of cellulose, which for its part is challenged forth by the need for paper, which is then delivered to newspapers and illustrated magazines. The latter, in their turn, set public opinion to swallowing what is printed, so that a set configuration of opinion becomes available on demand. Okay, so what was Heidegger getting at here, I think? You may have a different interpretation. Great. My read on this is that he's saying, here is a person, a member of the working class, not a group that Heidegger showed great interest in many ways, but on this occasion, yes, a member of the working class who is involved in the print industry in an extended way, right? He is doing what his family traditionally did, cutting down trees, yes? But in fact now what he's doing is determined by large corporations, and those corporations are utilizing the output from his labor to generate texts that he then reads for relaxation or for education, and those texts generate public opinion. So he is part of a cycle of meaning. He is this semiotic subject from Hegel that I mentioned earlier. But he has no understanding, probably, of the relationship between the labor he does to cut down a tree, the dominance of the corporation that decides how much he can sell, and the public opinion that is set when he consumes those texts. This is, for me, a call for a new kind of study of culture, very much as driven by the agendas of those scientists from the countries that are the destinations of e-waste, and very much as per the work of some of the artists whose labours I've shown on the screen, for a new approach to meaning that is not so interested in hermeneutic interpretation, but is more engaged with tracking the entire life of the commodity sign. So, okay. Where was this made? Who made it? What's in it? What is its carbon footprint in its manufacture? When it is then transported to Lisbon, what is its implication in use of energy during its life here? When it is discarded, where does it go? What happens to it? Who recycles it? Is it done safely or unsafely? In other words, thinking about who and how and by whom it was made, what it does, and where it goes. This is the real circuit of culture that I think we should be trying to understand as analysts. Thank you very much.
So we can take some questions.
Very interesting presentation, Toby. My name is Dago. Throughout your speech, I kept reminding myself of Ivan Illich in many of his books writing on grassroots movements and how he himself felt a little bit sometimes a hypocrite using a computer to write about grassroots movements. He wrote about unschooling society, about saying no to the modern medical treatment, talked about modernized poverty, and all of this to me has a lot to do with what I see in Brazil, where 80% of the population live in the big centers, capital cities. My question would be, you presented to us in many ways the problem. Also, in the end, a hint of here's what could be done. Who made this? Where did it come from? And in the beginning, you also commented that you're not specifically talking about films that talk about that show environmental problems, starting, let's say, there with an Inconvenient Truth, which was a big hit in 2000 something. Whereas now, I don't know if this is your opinion too, many people don't, oh, this is another eco film, I don't even want to watch it. Or if they're scrolling their Facebooks, oh, here's another picture of something going wrong, I don't know where, I'm just going to go on. About this, the numbing, we're in 2015. What about this numbing effect from the current media, that maybe from so much that we're receiving, that makes us maybe even care less, or even we're suspicious of the font, where the information came from anyway. It's on Facebook, so who knows where it came from. I'm sorry for a strange question. It's not really a question, it's a comment, and I would like to hear what you have to comment about that. Thank you.
Can we take more questions and then you... Anyone else?
Well, thank you for your talk. I was wondering, how can we go about reading the media? Because that was okay. We did so much. I was actually knowledgeable of many of these facts because I'm also in clinical philosophy, and and I'm also a theater person. So whenever I have certain criticism about this whole thing, let's go back to theater. But how can we go about reading the media? So that was is basic.
That's what the talk should have been about.
I guess on the effect of the numbing effect, another word that I want to bring in, and that we have already had an opportunity to briefly discuss together the other night, is the word sustainability, which is becoming so widespread and used in all forms and to describe all sorts of aspects of life today, and that in my mind it has a very ambivalent and dubious set of meanings, some of which seem to have to do more with how we sustain our consumption, our style of consumption, in spite of a number of things, including economic crisis, including the environmental threats, etc. So how do we continue to live as we have done for a long time? So I guess again, not really a question, but more a desire to hear you talk a little bit about how the word sustainability is possibly becoming part of this numbing effect that has already been mentioned, you know, a sort of a way of granting our, or, you know, bringing our conscience, I guess. Thank you.
Hi Toby, we were just wondering here, you said that you came from cultural studies, so you would end up with a positive note. As you end up agreeing with a Nazi, I was just wondering what was the positive note.
Around. Okay, everybody hear me all right? So thanks for those great responses. They're very important, I think, and I think I'm going to try to answer them all as one, actually, because I see them as somewhat connected. In terms of is this going okay? The right distance from the mic? Yeah. In terms of sustainability, I guess, Lara, this is one of these problems about reformism, right? That, and I'm in many ways a reformist rather than a revolutionary, just because I'm opposed to violence whenever possible. And one of the difficulties with reformism is that it produces these midpoints that end up not being ecocentric, but being actually quite still anthropocentric. And the term sustainability has been used in many cases to suggest basically we can keep going the same way we have been with a couple of changes around the margins. Right? One of the difficulties here is that this doesn't deal with the fundamental problem of growth. I mean, Sophia mentioned the terrible difficulties experienced by the Portuguese economy in the last few years and brought into question the idea of crisis. Of course, part of that crisis is manufactured through redistribution of income upwards and through ideas about growth that are deeply problematic from environmental perspectives, but have absolute hold as common sense in most economics faculties, in most government departments, and in the bourgeois media. And it's hard to see how one can have a transformation of the kind required in ecological terms without a transformation in economic thinking to go along with it. Now, how does that occur, that transformation? Getting back to, was it Tiago? Dago, sorry. One Tiago, one Dago. So, one of the ways in which these false gods are promulgated in the United States is through coin-operated think tanks. So, in the US at least, for instance, when Rick and I write our monthly column in Psychology Today online, people who almost certainly are paid to write in corrections or complaints or denunciations. Some of these people actually believe what they say, of course, but without a doubt a lot of them are paid. And that's the case certainly across the United States with any kind of discussion about environmental questions. So part of the incredible negativity that you see arising on Twitter, for example, about environmental issues in particular, is paid for by corporations. We don't know how much, we just know a lot of it happens. And you can talk to any of the more sophisticated research arms of green advocacy organizations. They know who the companies are, they know who the people are who write these apparently spontaneous citizen responses, and they're even sometimes going out drinking with them on Friday nights. So part of the issue is getting at and exposing that false demotic tone that comes with skepticism about, say, climate change. But I think you're also talking about tone, Dago, as well as skepticism. And here it seems to me one of the problems, and this gets to why one might cite Marty the Nazi, one of the difficulties is that environmentalists are always doing this. You know, don't do that, don't enjoy this, etc. And it seems to me that whilst the warnings are real and should be real, and should sometimes be delivered in shrill terms, we've had now 50 years of the modern environmental movement scaring people and telling them off. And for a time it worked very effectively. It's not clear that it always works well now. So I honestly think there needs to be more of a sense of hipness and fun and humour. So this t-shirt is from a Greenpeace campaign that you can see on YouTube, where they ripped off ideas from Star Wars and compared Star Wars figures to the Volkswagen company as part of getting VW to become more ecological. It worked. Now, of course, it worked in concert with boring, mundane public policy lobbying, going into the complex corridors of power, as the physicist novelist C.P. Snow coined them, and dealing with policymakers and other lobbyists and arguing against certain interests in favour of others and mobilising science effectively. But part of it was also humour and art, and I really think those things are tremendously important components to get away from the one more inconvenient truth movie. One more finger-wagging, non-hip-shaking, moralistic green person telling me not to be happy. And this relates a little bit to some of my experiences talking about these topics in Mexico and Chile and Costa Rica and Peru. And my experience there is that people my age and who are lightish-skinned get very angry at me and say, "Who do you think you are? You bastards destroyed half the world, maybe all the world. You consumed and produced anything you wanted. Now we've finally got some money, and you're telling us we can't do the same. We should go and be good Indians." Right? You are a cultural imperialist, shut up and go away. I mean, they're very nice, and they do take you out to dinner afterwards, but that is how they feel, and I get it. Very different reaction from the young people, often indigenous or mestizo in the audiences, or those who are, say, working security, who say, "I know this already, you're right, we all know this." It's fascinating, generational difference. So part of this is, in theatrical terms, trying to know your audience. It's not as though you lie to one audience and tell the truth to another, right? It's that you try to find out what it is that animates people, that dynamizes them, that turns them on, and you couch the scientific truth in those terms. Yes? And to finish off, in terms of how one might go about this within the media themselves, it seems to me that there are a couple of ways. One way is that in terms of the labour process, one tries to create a cosmopolitan sense of identification across territories and across industrial sectors between workers. So, for example, I'm sure you're all familiar with the company Foxconn, which is a Taiwan-based company with well over 1 million employees. Many of them are based in China, dozens of whom in the last few years have committed suicide at work, throwing themselves into atriums in the factories where they are forced to live and work. Many of them working upwards of 18 hours a day and 7 days a week. I've tried to visit these factories, I should say unsuccessfully, but others have visited them. Now, Foxconn is a company that, as I said, is based in Taiwan but has people working for it all over the world, actually in increasing numbers in the US now, but a lot in India, a lot in Mexico. Those workers are beginning to connect trans-territorially to talk about their common problems. Similarly, what we need is people in, say, very heavily unionized areas, like television network stations in the United States, connecting to those who are making the technologies they're using, and also connecting to their brethren in the ununionized elements of television. For instance, the cable industry in the United States, where there's like 3% unionization. So we need, in part, a labour-based connectivity, yes, about occupational health and safety issues, but driven by this notion of a life of the commodity sign approach. That's one way. Then there's a second way, which is where people who are scholars can be involved. And that is, A, to work with the activists and other scientists, because many of these activists are scientists and vice versa, who are doing the studies about occupational health and safety and environmental impact that I mentioned earlier, right? In particular, from the countries that I mentioned. To work with them, to learn from them, and to put what they teach into our curriculum. Because much of what we teach is part of the liberal education model as variously defined and recreated around the world. They're breadth requirement courses. They're not just for majors who are really interested in theatre or philosophy or whatever. They're part of how you learn how to be, right? They're humanities style courses and classes. Very rarely do they include significant components that are reflexive about ecology. And that reflexivity, which is what Marty the Nazi is calling for on behalf of the Forester, is exactly what we need to be giving ourselves and all our students. So it involves some serious re-education for us and a transformation of our curriculum.
Can I ask something?
No, we're finished now.
What about reduction, reducing, cutting down on all these gadgets? Is that possible in your reformist way of thinking?
This is, of course, a great question, and it's one that many of us pose to ourselves every day. And it applies when we're told, just click on this, and first of all read this 50-page contract which you won't read, and then click on this and you'll get better iTunes, right? Or you'll get a better version of Word, or something will improve. Will it really improve? What's it actually doing? Some things can be driven towards change through consumer action, without a doubt. But unfortunately, not everything. And there is both a conceptual problem with consumer action and a practical problem. The conceptual problem with consumer activism is that it is plutocratic, in the same way that the IMF and the World Bank are plutocratic. It's plutocratic because it gives more power to those who are wealthy. Yeah? If you're not a consumer, your vote doesn't matter, as it were. This is, in the same way the IMF and the World Bank are driven in democratic terms by how much nations contribute financially, right? More votes, more contribution. So consumer activism can be similar. Jimi Hendrix never had these problems. Come to listen, you can't even get this right. Sorry. So that's one problem, conceptual of consumer activism, that it is fundamentally plutocratic. The second pragmatic problem is that a lot of it is already thought out, thought through and bettered by corporations because of their logic of built-in obsolescence. Right? So you can say, for example, well, I don't want the latest iTunes download because I don't want a U2 album for free. In fact, you'd have to pay me to accept it. But life's going to get very tough if in terms of what your job requires or your school parent-teacher board requires is access to software that your hardware no longer permits you to get because you haven't upgraded. And that built-in obsolescence model for both hardware and software is central to the way that these major corporations operate. So we need, in addition to legislative change and policing change of legislation, which I haven't talked about, serious transformation in the ethos of these corporations. They need to be held to account, held accountable for the unnecessary overuse of new technology, which is something that they do because what they care about is their valuation on Wall Street. That is essentially what this is about. And you can only have high valuation with high innovation. This was not the case in capitalism 30 years ago, and it doesn't have to be the case in capitalism 30 years from now. So some of the reduction model must derive not only from consumer action, but from action against the particular moment of capitalism we are in, which is about valuation by bankers and brokers of quality, and not to do with productivity, and not to do with supply and demand.
What would be the impact of this shift in terms of media studies and cultural studies, film studies, this shift from this anthropocentric society perspective to an ecocentric? What would be the impact and how to do it?
Well, I don't want to suggest that I'm the only one trying to do it. I'm not at all. There's a whole group that calls itself Eco-Media that has a good website. You can subscribe to their email list if you are interested, and there are increasing numbers of people in cultural and communications technologies and historical studies doing this work. So you could think about Lisa Parks or Jonathan Stern as a couple of very well-known names. And I wouldn't suggest it isn't happening already, but what needs to happen, I think, is this. Given that film studies in particular has always had something over literary studies, something better than literary studies, which was that, whereas in literary studies, nobody knows how a book is made, physically, nobody knows what an agent does, nobody knows what are bestsellers, nobody knows how the book industry operates. They never bothered. It's text, 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 and imagine reader response. They know nothing. They don't care about these other things. They're not of interest. Film studies has always had a more plebeian, materialist perspective. So the history of technology matters. The Hollywood Paramount Decree matters. Ideas about vertical centralization of control matter. People actually know about these things and are interested in them. Students like them, right? So we've always had that as part of our teaching and part of our course matter. What we haven't had is saying, for example, that the town of Rochester, New York, anybody been to Rochester, New York? Anybody from there? They've all got two heads. So Rochester, New York was the home of Kodak for 80 years, and the Genesee River is 800,000 times more polluted than the acceptable norm for the federal administration of the environment in the United States, because of the dumping of the detritus of making film stock and other technologies there. That needs to be absolutely central to that very materialist, technological and legal and economic history that we already do in our teaching and writing. But it's not. It's left out of the story. It doesn't have to be. It can be included. Right? So in other words, I guess I'm suggesting A, there are plenty of people already doing this, not enough, but B, there are elements of practice that are already in place that position us very well to make this transformation in ways that do not apply in some of our places of origin, such as literary studies.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Or solutions? So maybe we can finish the session. Yes? And go and have a coffee. Don't tell us where it comes from, in what conditions and all that. Okay. So we have another block of sessions at 4:30, right? Okay. Thank you again, Toby.